Hello, everyone. This is Sam, and we're going to talk about occult detectives. Um, so, to clarify a few things before I go in, some of you that follow the pulp booktubers probably know that back in October there was a reading event called Occult Detective October, and I learned about it from Michael K. Vaughan, who I've mentioned frequently in my videos, and it seemed really interesting. Uh, and I really wanted to participate, but due to some personal life things, I really couldn't get involved. I didn't really find what I wanted to read in time, so I didn't participate. However, I really wanted to because I am actually, as I've said before, I'm a writer. And one of the things I was really planning on doing was writing an occult detective story that I had sort of been formulating since last year. I had sort of a vague idea in the summer. It was around mid September that I really found what I wanted to focus on, the story I wanted to do. And because of that, when I heard of Occult Detective October, I decided, I should really look at other occult detective works, partially for inspiration, and partially just to broaden my horizons, see how other people approach the concept, and also to be entertained. Reading is very pleasant when you're entertained. So, I am going to do my own little private event that I'm calling Occult Detective October in January. That name is a play on, if you've ever seen the YouTube personality, the Cinema Snob, you'll know that for a couple of years he had an event called Musical March in September. And it was when he would watch musicals in September, but he called it Musical March just because it was alliterative. So I'm going to be doing my own version of Occult Detective October, but in January. And while autumn is the time that a lot of people associate spooky and gothic fiction as that being the appropriate time for it, January is right in the middle of winter, so I think reading some occult detectives is still aesthetically appropriate for this month. So, to really start, before I really say what I'm going to read for this month, I first wanted to basically explain the concept of occult detectives. I'm sure a lot of you already know what they are, but I'm going to explain it just on the off chance there are some viewers who don't really know that much about the genre. So basically what occult detectives are exactly what they sound like, detectives in the occult. And detectives of the occult, which means that there's a fair amount of fantastical situations and beings, particularly magic. So, magic and the supernatural, that is the main bread and butter of occult detectives. So basically imagine a film noir detective, but instead of fighting the usual gangsters and murderers, he's dealing with werewolves and the Fae and ancient beings with magical powers. That's essentially the idea of an occult detective. It's sort of interesting. One thing, I was looking around, I wanted to find out if there was a parallel to occult detectives in science fiction, because occult detectives generally lean into the fantasy and horror genres, because they tend to deal more with traditional fantasy type characters and beings than science fiction related beings. And I tried looking up, I tried to say, well, is there like a sci-fi equivalent to occult detectives? And I really couldn't find a firm genre type for it, There's no like sci-fi detective or space detectives. Though Guandanaland Comics, who has a lot of public domain comic books, I remember he did have a couple of comics that were like Space Detective or something along those lines. And of course, there's a lot of cyberpunk stories that deal with private investigators. So there are science fiction detectives, but unlike occult detectives, they don't seem to have like codified the genre. Like it's very loose in terms of genre conventions, which is unlike the occult detectives, because there actually are quite a few genre conventions for occult detectives. If you want a modern example of an occult detective, I'll just choose the most well-known one, Harry Dresden, by the author Jim Butcher. And Harry Dresden is a wizard for hire in the city of Chicago. His gimmick is that he's the only wizard listed in the phone book of Chicago. And he goes on various adventures involving all the magical beings that pop up in the Tri-City area. So, you've probably heard of him, even if you haven't read him. He's a pretty popular character. But Jim Butcher was, of course, not the guy who invented the occult detective genre. That genre actually has its start in the 1800s. Earliest example I could find was sometime in the 1850s. But there were a lot of, but they were kind of quasi-examples. They were like sort of supernatural-esque things in a wider series, and it seemed like they were kind of scattered, and like there was not a firm definition of what an occult detective was during this period. But around the turn of the century, the very late 1800s and the early 1900s, that's when you start seeing the concept of an occult detective really come into being. You have a somewhat, some people debate whether he's an occult detective, but a lot of people sort of took inspiration from him, was Dr. Van Helsing from Dracula. Like I said, some people debate whether he's actually an occult detective, but he was very important in setting up the sort of idea of an occult detective. The idea of this learned gentleman who fights against unholy creatures that modern science doesn't really understand. So, shortly after and around Van Helsing, you get a bunch of characters from that era, like Dr. John Silence by Algernon Blackwood, and CARNACKI the Ghost Finder by William Hope Hodgson. And CARNACKI is, I've seen some people list him as the first official occult detective. I don't know what I don't know what the consensus is on that, but he pops up a lot as one of the first occult detectives. So you have the general idea of the occult detective established by the early 1900s, and they really become prominent during the pulp magazine era. Like it's said several times, I'm a huge Pulp Fiction fan, and occult detectives actually turn up a fair amount in the pulp era. Some of the more prominent ones are Jules de Grandin, who was created by Seabury Quinn, John Thunstone by Manly Wade Wellman. Yes, his first name was Manly, so. And Gregory Gordon George Green, or G's, who was created by E.C. Vivian. And there's plenty of others, but those are the most prominent examples from that era. And even the great H.P. Lovecraft actually kind of dipped his toes into the genre. I've heard some people say his works aren't fully occult detective because they don't necessarily go into every single trope that occult detectives do, but he does have several of these protagonists who are very well educated men who explore these strange phenomena and discover the paranormal. Sometimes they expect the paranormal, but a lot of times they don't. And if you know Lovecraft's fiction, it doesn't turn out well for a lot of them. So, and even I know about this because I played video games growing up. A lot of Lovecraft video games will have private detectives as the protagonists, like Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, and another one that came out a few years ago, I think it was just called Call of Cthulhu. And they both had private investigator main characters because that was a character type that just seemed to fit in Lovecraft's work. So even authors who didn't necessarily do straight examples of occult detectives dipped their toe into occult detective ideas, or at least took some elements from the genre. And still a very popular genre today. I was walking in Books A Million about 3 weeks ago, and I saw some plenty of Harry Dresden stories, but I also saw other paranormal investigator stories and other occult detective stories. And so it's still a very popular fantasy genre today. Some would say fantasy horror, because there actually is a lot of overlap of fantasy and horror in occult detective stories, because you can have since you can have magic, you can also have the magical creatures. So it's a very flourishing subgenre. You'll find a lot of examples of it today. And I was interested in writing my own, mostly because I wanted to see if I could find a way to put a new spin on it. So that's a big reason I'm investigating the genre and seeing if I can just write an interesting interpretation that people will enjoy. So for this event, I wrote down what the original prompts were for people who were participating in Occult Detective October, and I chose stories based on what people had written down. So the first week was supposed to be an occult detective from before 1960. Before 1960 is the pulp era, so I wanted to do a pulp occult detective. And I decided to choose Ravenwood, the stepson of mystery. This is him. It's kind of hard to see with this camera, but the guy holding the woman here is a pretty obvious trace of Lon Chaney's Phantom of the Opera from 1925. They don't do a lot to hide it, but Ravenwood was a occult detective written by Frederick C. Davis, and Davis was a pretty well-known pulp writer. And Ravenwood was what you called a backup character, because in the old days with pulp magazines, you would have the main story that was on the front, and then you'd have backup stories that came behind it. And this was particularly true in pulp hero magazines. Pulp heroes like The Shadow, Doc Savage, The Spider, and in Ravenwood's case, Secret Agent X. He was in the back pages of the Secret Agent X pulp magazine. And this was a common theme throughout hero pulp fiction of these like smaller heroes that would be in the back of the main hero's pulp magazine. Because the Shadow, I know the Shadow magazine had a couple stories of characters like the Skipper, the Whisperer, Sheridan Doom. So it was a pretty lucrative business. You obviously wouldn't write a full novel like you did for the Shadow, but you would write these like 5 or 6 chapter short stories and get a healthy paycheck from it, which was the main goal of a pulp writer. So Ravenwood was in the back of 5 issues of the Secret Agent X pulp magazine in 1936. And the whole thing about Ravenwood is that Ravenwood is a man who was raised by an Asian mystic, because Ravenwood's parents lived in India, and they sadly pass away in an epidemic, and just as Ravenwood's about to get sick, he's saved by the mystic whose name is the Nameless One. And he's nameless because he's so ancient that his name is meaningless. And he's also so into mysticism and sort of that Asian or Buddhist concept of letting go of attachments that he hasn't even kept his name. He's the Nameless One. Davis is a little vague on what the Nameless One's actual Asian philosophy is. It's heavily it's kind of framed sort of like Buddhism, but it's specified at one point to be yogi, which I think is meant to be an Indian mystical, an Indian belief system. So and the reason the Nameless One saves Ravenwood is that Ravenwood's father saved the Nameless One many years earlier when a tiger was about to attack the Nameless One. And the Nameless One promised to always protect the father's offspring should anything happen to him. And when something does, he comes and rescues Ravenwood and then raises him, training him in the mystical arts. So Ravenwood comes up under the tutelage of the Nameless One, and he gains supernatural senses. He gains a limited sixth sense. He has a wide knowledge of occult behaviors, particularly with Indian philosophy, because there's Indian concepts that are pushed in some of these stories, like the Juggernaut was an Indian concept. There was another one in here that I recognized as a Indian concept, and I'm talking about Asia, India, just to make sure folks understand. It's the India of Asia. So, what was the other concept? It was right here. Well, I can't find it, but Indian philosophy pops up a lot. And so using his sixth sense, Ravenwood helps his clients in Los Angeles, because he's located in Los Angeles. He helps them figure out these seemingly unexplainable crimes that are happening to them, and often have a supernatural bent to them. So, as occult detectives go, he's kind of more low-key about the occultism, but the fantasy and element is still very present with the character. So, this will be interesting. So the second prompt was an occult detective from after 1960. And I got lazy with this one because I decided to just choose easy one. It was a Harry Dresden novel, Grave Peril. This is the third book in the series. And I chose this one because I've read the first two Harry Dresden books over the last couple of years, but I wanted to get back into reading it because I haven't read the books for a while. And I remembered reading the first one where it dealt with him fighting a dark wizard, and I think vampires popped up at one point. And then the second one was about werewolves. So I was interested in this one also because it had an interesting idea. Because the plot of this is that in the Chicago area, there's suddenly a lot of violent attacks on the living by ghosts. The ghosts are going nuts in Chicago, and Harry's got to figure out why. And it also doesn't help that a lot of the victims are seemingly tied to Harry. So this has an interesting hook, and I just like the Dresden stories I've read, so this will be a lot of fun. Okay, the third prompt was diverse author / character. In this one, I was kind of looking for excuse to do a female occult detective, because there was a lot of male occult detectives, but it seemed like it was a little harder to find female ones, though there are a fair number of examples. But I wanted to challenge myself and say, all right, can I find one that was during the pulp era? Because I was reading a magazine from the Pulpster. The Pulpster is the official magazine of Pulp Fest, and it had an article in the latest Pulpster about the sort of the downplaying of women's role in science fiction pulp magazines, as there actually were a fair number of women contributors to science fiction pulp magazines, but their contributions were somewhat downplayed as the years went on. So I was like, well, can I find a not just a female occult detective, but a female writer, female pulp writer? And I actually did manage to find one in the book The Undying Monster by the author Jessie Douglas Kerruish. And this was written in 1922 and features a female occult detective named Luna Bartondale. Luna is described as being a small and pretty woman who also has psychic abilities, and also has a big dog named Rosca. So that kind of interested me. I also wanted to choose this book because it would allow me to do a Ladies of the Pulps episode. And supposedly, I've heard some people who read this book say there might be a werewolf in it. So if there does turn out to be one, I can do a werewolf episode too. So this will be a lot of fun. And the fourth prompt was anything goes. You could pick whatever you want. And I decided I was going to pick a comic book instead of a actual literary character. And so I decided to choose a character called Werewolf Hunter. And this was a comic book that I found from Guandanaland Comics, the public domain comic book collector that I mentioned earlier. And Werewolf Hunter focuses on a character named Armand Broussard, who's this older man who's an expert in occultism, who travels the world helping those who are being preyed upon by supernatural creatures. Obviously, werewolves are one of them, though every comic book resource I've read online says he actually doesn't fight all that many werewolves. But he does fight some, and he fights a lot of other occult figures. So it allows me to do a comic book and a werewolf episode, so that was a big reason I chose him. And I was just kind of interested in this idea of a character who's like an older man who apparently doesn't have much in the way of weapons, but still fights evil in his own way. So that's going to be interesting. Now, that was the end of the official prompts, but I wanted to do one more reading, just as kind of a makeup story to make up for my tardiness. I decided to pick one of those really early occult detectives to read, and I decided to choose this one, The Complete CARNACKI Ghost Finder, by William Hope Hodgson. And I chose him mostly because he's one of the more famous early occult detectives. And some of it was sheer chance. This book was actually on sale from the company Adventure House, who does a lot of pulp and comic book vending. And this was actually on their Black Friday sale. And I looked through their stuff, and I couldn't really find any Black Friday stuff I wanted except for this. And I was like, oh, this could work. Because one reason I also wanted is that the original CARNACKI stories are in the public domain because they were written long enough ago. But supposedly there are a few stories on here that weren't officially published until several decades after Hodgson's death. So I don't know about whether those stories would be available online because of their copyright status. But not all 6 of the original plus the 3 that were discovered later are in this book. So the basic gist of CARNACKI is that he's an occult detective version of Sherlock Holmes. Because he lives in London, he has a friend he narrates his stories to, just like Holmes did to Watson. And CARNACKI is focused on, as the name implies, ghosts. He's focused on ghosts and hauntings. And the thing that really interested me was that people had told me that the stories apparently have different conclusions, in the sense that sometimes the hauntings are legitimate and sometimes they're not. And it's kind of a game of trying to figure out, okay, which one is a legitimate haunting and which one is just like someone doing a Scooby-Doo shenanigan, pretending to be a monster, a ghost, and no, it's all fake. So that really interested me, so I really want to check these out. And yeah, that's gonna be my plan for Occult Detective October in January. If any of these seem interesting to you, you can read along, but this is mostly just my personal event because I wanted to make up for lost time and really dig into the genre so that I knew what worked and what didn't. So thank you very much for listening, and I will see you in the near future. Bye.